In the spring of 1889, high atop the fog-blanketed ridges of Westerbrook County, Vermont, a grand structure emerged, a sprawling estate of Gothic beauty known as Crowder Hill School for Young Gentlemen. Built with red brick facades, iron-laced balconies, and towering spires that cut the clouds, the institution seemed destined to become a haven for education and refinement. It was the brainchild of Sir Alistair Crowder, a British-born scholar who had relocated to America following the Civil War. A man of rigid ideals and noble upbringing, he dreamed of creating a place where boys could be molded into statesmen, generals, and thinkers of great discipline and resolve. Inspired by the traditions of Eton and Harrow, he envisioned a school that would strip away the softness of youth and forge character through silence, structure, and routine. The opening ceremony was a grand affair. Horse-drawn carriages rolled up the hill carrying senators, generals, and landowners from across the East Coast. The Vermont Tribune called it the most elite institution north of Boston. That day, Sir Crowder stood before a crowd of 300 and declared, "We are not here to educate boys. We are here to shape men." From the very beginning, everything about Crowder Hill screamed excellence. The boys wore navy blue wool uniforms with gold buttons. Their meals were served on silver dishes in a candle-lit dining hall. Each day began with Latin recitations and ended with silent prayer under the watchful eye of head instructors. Music, literature, mathematics, and fencing were taught with military precision. To the world, it was perfect. But that illusion of perfection masked a troubling truth. The land beneath Crowder Hill had a forgotten past, one soaked in blood, sorrow, and silence. Long before the school existed, in the year 1777, the Crowder Hill Ridge had been the site of a brutal Revolutionary War clash known as the Battle of Black Pines. Nearly 212 colonial and British soldiers had perished there, their bodies buried in shallow, unmarked graves when winter snow made proper burial impossible. Locals avoided the ridge for decades, warning travelers of ghost lights in the trees and sudden sicknesses that befell those who wandered too long. Old maps of Westerbrook showed warnings like "Avoid the Ridge" and "The Field of Whispers," marked crudely in charcoal. But to Sir Alistair, a man of science and order, such tales were nonsense. He believed structure could tame even the wildest ghosts, so the school was built, and the first mistake was made. The architect, Daniel Whitmore, reported unsettling disturbances during construction. Tools disappeared overnight, masonry crumbled as if weakened by unseen hands. Workers claimed to hear voices calling from underground, soft, desperate voices that spoke in neither English nor any known dialect. One worker fell from the bell tower under mysterious circumstances. Another vanished entirely, leaving behind only his boots and a hammer, yet the build continued, deadlines were met, corners were cut. And the whispers were silenced until the boys arrived. Within the first few weeks of operation, some students reported strange dreams. They spoke of a figure in black, watching from the tree line. One child, Henry Blake, age 13, woke screaming every night for a week, claiming his bed was being shaken by cold hands. Rather than investigate, the staff labeled him as imaginative and emotionally weak. He was punished by being locked in the cellar for 24 hours, a punishment they referred to as reflection isolation. Henry changed after that. He stopped speaking entirely. His parents were told he had adjusted well. He would go on to disappear 2 years later without explanation. As more unsettling incidents occurred, staff maintained a facade of strict elegance. Nothing was ever allowed to interrupt the reputation of Crowder Hill. Parents were kept at bay with carefully curated letters. Alumni were encouraged to remain silent about unpleasant experiences. After all, weren't they now successful? But something in the walls remembered. The foundations were laid not just in brick and stone, but in grief, fear, and forgotten bones. And though Sir Crowder died in 1895, his methods lived on long after him. So did the whispers. Crowder Hill may have begun as a temple of discipline and aristocracy. But from its first breath it was haunted, not only by what lay beneath the soil, but by the pride of men who believed order was more powerful than truth. What was built to raise young men would go on to break them. From the moment a boy stepped through the wrought iron gates of Crowder Hill School for Young Gentlemen, he was no longer simply a student. He was property of the institution. His name became a number. His schedule became scripture. His identity, his softness, his dreams, slowly stripped away in the name of what the school called building discipline. To the outside world, Crowder Hill was a temple of higher education. But within its walls, a far more chilling reality unfolded. A system so rigid, so dehumanizing, that it blurred the line between structure and punishment. Every day began at 4:45 a.m. sharp, not with a bell, but a piercing whistle that echoed through the stone dormitories. Students had 5 minutes to dress, make their beds with military corners, and line up outside in silence. Speaking was forbidden. Smiling was discouraged. The slightest delay resulted in being marked defiant, a label that triggered consequences ranging from loss of meals to hours in the cold cellar. Classes were taught by men who had once been soldiers, clergy, and in one case, a former prison warden. They prided themselves on breaking arrogance, cleansing rebellion, and instilling obedience. And so the curriculum wasn't just about education, it was about psychological control. Latin, mathematics, and literature were taught not for enlightenment, but for memorization and performance. Boys were required to recite entire speeches by Cicero and Shakespeare without a single word out of place. A missed word, 30 lashes with a ruler across the palm. A stutter, kneeling on coarse salt in the chapel for an hour. One former student, Elias Morton, recalled in a journal found years later, "We were taught that failure meant shame, that emotion meant weakness. I watched boys cry and get locked away until the tears dried out of them." At the heart of this twisted doctrine was a place known only as the basement. Officially, it was called the reflection room. Unofficially, it was a dungeon. Located beneath the dormitory wing, the basement was a stone-walled corridor with no windows and a single hanging bulb that flickered like a dying star. Boys who disobeyed, even minor things like forgetting a prayer, laughing during mealtime, or asking to go home, were sent there. Some spent hours in isolation, others spent days. Rumors swirled that the longest someone had stayed down there was 9 days without light, food delivered through a slot, and only cold water to drink. The basement wasn't just a punishment, it was a message. It said, "You belong to us, you will be remade, you will obey." And yet, this cruelty was masked by beautiful lies. Parents visiting on holidays saw smiling staff, tidy uniforms, and staged performances of classical music. But what they didn't see were the silent stares, the flinching boys, and the coded fear etched into every movement. Punishments extended beyond physical spaces. The staff used shame as a weapon. Students were ranked not only by grades but by virtue scores, an arbitrary number assigned by the faculty. Boys with low scores were humiliated publicly, forced to wear burlap sashes marked B for broken, or made to eat meals in silence while the rest dined joyfully. Letters to family were censored or rewritten. A boy could be suffering from sleep deprivation and mental anguish, but the letter home would say, "I am learning so much. The discipline is tough, but I'm growing stronger." Some boys tried to resist. They whispered in code, passed messages behind books, but those caught rebelling were either expelled quietly or, more often, subjected to psychological isolation, where teachers pretended they no longer existed. Entire classrooms were instructed not to speak to them, look at them, or acknowledge them. These tactics weren't accidental, they were crafted. Behind the scenes, documents discovered decades later revealed that the school's founding pedagogy was influenced by the theory of obedient hierarchy, an obscure 19th century discipline model that argued the best men were made through controlled suffering, prolonged silence, and removal of self-will, and it worked, at least on the surface. Crowder Hill graduates went on to become judges, commanders, and professors, but many of them admitted later in life that they suffered from lifelong depression, trust issues, nightmares, and detachment from their own families. One former student in an anonymous letter to a newspaper wrote, "They called it schooling, I now call it survival. What they did to us wasn't education, it was war, and I carry those scars, invisible though they are. So was it discipline? Or was it a well-dressed cage. What Crowder Hill taught wasn't just obedience. It was how to suppress emotion, how to fear mistakes, and how to accept control without question. And that is the most dangerous curriculum of all. It was the winter of 1904 when Crowder Hill School for Young Gentlemen faced its most brutal season, a time that would come to be known by former students and staff alike as the year of the cold room. Vermont winters were always harsh, but that year the snow came early and never let up. The sky remained a blanket of ash-gray clouds for months. Temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees F, and gusts of wind howled through the narrow mountain passes like wolves looking for prey. The school's outdated coal heating system, built in the late 1800s, failed completely by early December. The pipes froze, the boiler cracked, and no repairs could be made until spring. With the building's thick stone walls trapping the cold inside, Crowder Hill became a frost-bitten tomb. The administration, led by Headmaster Emery Blackstone, refused to send the boys home. In his words, "The storm may rage, but discipline must not shiver." Blankets were rationed. 2 students per bed became the norm. Hot meals turned into lukewarm gruel, and morning exercises were still expected outside, even as frostbite slowly crept into fingertips and toes. It was during this bitter cold that 4 students began to change. Their names were Thomas Lane, Julian Firth, Samuel Alcott, and Benedict Rowe, boys from privileged families known for their intellect, wit, and discipline. They were top of their class, obedient, focused, and admired. But as the cold deepened, something shifted in them. It started subtly. They withdrew from conversation. They stopped raising their hands in class. They stared blankly during meals. One night, Julian was found in the courtyard barefoot, whispering Latin verses, words he had never been taught. He claimed he wasn't cold, though his lips were blue and his skin like ice. Soon, the others followed suit. They refused food, refused sleep, refused to answer when spoken to. They would huddle in corners of the room, sometimes speaking in unison. One of the housemasters noted in a journal, "They are not boys anymore. They are something else, as if the cold has emptied them out, replaced them." Rumors swept through the dormitories like a shadow. Other boys began whispering about the room at the end of the east wing, a disused study hall that had been turned into a storage closet. They called it the cold room. No one had been assigned there, yet the boys, Thomas, Julian, Samuel, and Benedict, were often found sleeping inside it. The cold room had no windows, no insulation, no light. Just a cracked portrait of Sir Alistair Crowder on the wall and a warped wooden floor. Teachers found frost patterns in the shape of strange symbols etched on the walls, though no student claimed to have drawn them. One instructor, Mr. Harlan, tried to scrub them off. Hours later, he collapsed in the chapel, mumbling something about watchers in the ice. Then came the storm. In late February, a blizzard hit Westerbrook with such force that the school was cut off from the town for 7 straight days. The power died completely, food rations dwindled, panic set in among the younger boys. That's when Samuel Alcott, once a quiet, brilliant student, stood up in the middle of morning prayers and screamed, "They walk at night. Don't you see them? They come from under the floor." He had to be restrained. His fingers bled from scratching at the wooden chapel pews. That same night, Julian Firth vanished. His bed was made, his boots were in place, but he was gone. The staff claimed he had run away obedient, disoriented from cold. But the truth haunted the students who remained. No footprints were found in the snow. The window had never opened, and his last entry in his personal notebook simply read, "The cold room opens only for the chosen." In the aftermath of Julian's disappearance, the 3 remaining boys, Thomas, Samuel, and Benedict, were separated and sent to different dormitories. They never spoke again. Months later, each would quietly leave the school before graduation, never to return or write again. Some say the extreme weather affected their minds. Others believe something darker had taken root in the very walls of Crowder Hill. Something ancient, awakened by the cold and fed by isolation, silence, and fear. Whatever the truth, the year of the cold room left a scar on Crowder Hill. Teachers resigned, students transferred, and parents whispered of shadows that stretched far beyond what any curriculum could control. But for those who survived that winter, the lesson wasn't about fear. It was about resilience, about how the mind, when pushed to its limit, must fight not only the cold outside, but the darkness within. In the spring of 1921, over 3 decades after the founding of Crowder Hill School for Young Gentlemen, a seemingly routine restoration project would unearth the most disturbing chapter in its already troubled history. The school's old chapel, an austere stone building nestled behind the main dormitories, was undergoing renovation. Years of snow and decay had worn down its wooden flooring, and so 2 carpenters were assigned the task of replacing the rotting boards. As they worked near the altar, one of their hammers struck something hollow beneath the floor. Curious, they pried up a panel and found a rusted, iron-latched box, wrapped in decayed cloth and sealed with wax. At first, the workers assumed it was part of a forgotten donation, perhaps old school records or religious artifacts, but inside they found something far more human, a leather-bound diary, worn but miraculously intact. On the inside cover was the name, James Edwin Hawley's class of 1897. At first glance, James Hawley's was no different than the dozens of boys who passed through Crowder Hill in its early years. He was the son of a textile merchant from Massachusetts, intelligent and observant, known for his poetry and quiet strength. But as the diary revealed, James was not just a student, he was a witness, and he had seen everything. The first few pages of the diary chronicled daily life at Crowder Hill, Latin lessons, cold baths, long marches in silence, but soon the entries turned darker, more urgent. James wrote of strange gatherings at night. Not by students, but by faculty. He referred to a secret faction within the school known only as the Gavel Order. According to James, the Gavel Order was not a myth or an exaggeration. It was a real, functioning society of teachers and administrators who believed that true greatness in a boy could only be summoned through pain, deprivation, and fear. They held midnight meetings beneath the chapel. They selected certain students, always the brightest, most sensitive, and subjected them to cruel psychological experiments. He described a hidden passage from the library that led to a locked chamber beneath the basement, where boys were isolated for days. Sometimes the experiments were physical, exposure to cold, enforced fasting, sensory deprivation. Other times they were mental, relentless interrogation, false accusations, or forced recitations until collapse. One entry, dated February 12, 1896, read, "Tonight Thomas B. was taken. They said he broke a rule, but I saw no rule broken. He returned with bruises and eyes that wouldn't meet mine. He told me the walls whispered. He told me not to ask questions. I am afraid, not of what's happening, but of who allows it." James' tone changed as the pages went on. He became paranoid, convinced he was being watched. He claimed that his belongings were being moved in his absence, that his journal had been tampered with. His handwriting grew more erratic, his sentences fragmented, but even in the chaos he documented everything. He described rituals conducted in the old cold room with staff dressed in black robes and candles arranged in a spiral. He wrote about waking up in the middle of the night to find chalk symbols drawn on the floor beneath his bed, and perhaps most disturbingly, he documented the disappearances, students who were there one day and gone the next. In his final entry, dated April 3, 1897, James wrote, "They say we're being prepared for the world, but what kind of world turns boys into ghosts before they've even lived? I can't stay silent. If they find this journal, they'll know, but if someone reads it after, maybe the truth will finally breathe." The diary ended there. When the box was discovered, the 2 carpenters turned it over to the school authorities. Within 24 hours, the diary was confiscated. The headmaster at the time, Charles Whitmore, ordered the workers to remain silent. But one of them, a young man named Reuben Finch, had secretly made copies of the most damning pages. A decade later, in 1932, long after he'd left Vermont, Reuben mailed those pages to a local newspaper under a false name. The story made headlines briefly, but without the original diary or witnesses, it was dismissed as sensationalism, and yet, those who attended Crowder Hill during that era confirmed the names, the events, and the darkness that James Hawley's had recorded. The chapel was never fully restored. The hidden chamber was sealed, and James Hollis, he was never seen or heard from again after his graduation. Some say he ran away. Others believe he was silenced. But one thing remains true. His words, written in secret and buried beneath sacred ground, became the first undeniable crack in Crowder Hill's elegant facade, because the truth may be hidden under floorboards, but it never stays buried forever. By the early 1940s, whispers of unease and long, buried secrets clung to Crowder Hill School like frost on its Gothic spires. The stories, once dismissed as childish rumors or the dramatic musings of overworked staff, had begun to surface with more frequency and greater intensity. The school's once pristine reputation was beginning to fray. And at the helm of it all stood a man known only for his silence, order, and terrifying calm, Headmaster Walter Thorne. Walter Thorne was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. With a stare alone, he could quiet a room, freeze a student mid-sentence, or send a teacher scrambling to correct a perceived error. He came from a military background and had studied classical education in Europe before being offered the top position at Crowder Hill in 1935. To many, Thorne was a savior. He promised to restore the school's former glory. Enrollment had declined, wealthy families were choosing more modern academies, and alumni donations had begun to slow. Thorne's arrival brought with it a renewed sense of structure. Uniforms were redesigned, morning marches were reinstated, silence was enforced in dormitories after 6 p.m. Discipline became doctrine, but those who served under him, teachers, kitchen staff, janitors, soon noticed something disturbing. Beneath the discipline was a hunger for power, and under that, a darkness far more sinister. Thorne was obsessed with control. He reintroduced solitary confinement chambers beneath the West Wing dormitories. Students who underperformed, academically or emotionally, were subjected to hours, sometimes days, of sensory deprivation. Teachers were required to keep detailed logs of each student's behavior, eye contact, posture, speech, even recurring dreams. These were filed weekly in what became known as the observation book, which only Thorne had access to. One former housemaster, Mr. Carl Drayton, later confessed in a private interview he wasn't running a school, he was running a psychological experiment. We weren't educators anymore, we were observers, and the boys, they were subjects. In 1943, things began to unravel. That year, 3 students vanished during a snowstorm. Their belongings remained untouched. Their names were never mentioned in school records again. When parents wrote letters demanding answers, they received the same typed response. Your son has been transferred for his safety and development. Further contact is discouraged. A month later, beloved literature instructor Ms. Evelyn Carter, the only female faculty member, was found dead in her quarters. An apparent suicide, but whispers told another story. Students claimed she had been snooping in the observation room, where Thorne kept files, sealed boxes, and audio recordings no one else was permitted to hear. Shortly after her death, the local police were called to the school following an anonymous tip. They found nothing at first, only silence and locked doors. Thorne cooperated with a gentlemanly calm, and the investigation was brief. But 2 weeks later, another letter was leaked to the local press. It contained copies of student logs with disturbing language. Subject 14 exhibits signs of emotional independence. Intervention needed. Subject 22 requested prayer. Spiritual resistance detected. Subject 7 shows potential for rebellion. Schedule 3rd isolation. The story exploded. Parents descended upon the campus. Journalists camped outside the wrought iron gates. Former students came forward with accounts of isolation, manipulation, emotional torment, and worse. One man claimed he had been locked in a wooden box as a child for 3 days. Another described ritualistic ceremonies conducted under the guise of discipline, involving masks and Latin chants. The U.S. Department of Education, under public pressure, sent a federal team to investigate. What they found behind the walls of Crowder Hill would haunt them for years, narrow hallways leading to underground rooms not listed on any blueprint. Shelves stacked with recordings of students crying, reciting confessions, or screaming. Hundreds of files marked failed subjects, names of boys who had disappeared or transferred under suspicious circumstances. Prayer books altered to include strange invocations. A locked safe containing a black ledger titled simply, "The Gavel Doctrine." Within days, the school was shut down. Thorne disappeared that same night. Staff believed he fled through one of the old servant tunnels, passages that connected the main building to the woods beyond the property. He was never arrested. Some say he boarded a ship to Europe. Others believe he died in those woods, taken by the very shadows he once commanded. Crowder Hill was declared a hazard. The buildings were sealed. Over the decades, ivy crept across the stone. Snow filled the gutters, and time did what it always does. It buried the past, but those who had walked those halls never forgot. They didn't just leave Crowder Hill behind, they carried it inside them. Many suffered nightmares, trust issues, and lifelong fear of authority, but others turned their pain into purpose. They became counselors, teachers, authors. They spoke out, they healed, and they made sure the world never forgot what happens when power goes unchecked behind polished doors. The fall of Crowder Hill was not just the end of a school. It was the unmasking of a legacy built on cruelty, and the beginning of a conversation the world still struggles to have. How many institutions have mistaken punishment for growth? How many lives have been shaped by fear disguised as structure? And how many James Hollises are still out there waiting to be heard? Crowder Hill School for Young Gentlemen is no longer listed in educational registries. Its buildings are fenced off, overtaken by ivy and the hush of wind through shattered windows. What was once hailed as a citadel of discipline and excellence now sits hollow, hidden beneath the weight of secrets and suffering. But the ruins of Crowder Hill are not just brick and wood. They are a warning, and the silence that surrounds them speaks louder than any headmaster ever could. This story, one of prestige turned poison, of boys transformed into subjects, of tradition twisted into tyranny, leaves behind lessons that we must never forget. Because while Crowder Hill may have been shuttered decades ago, its legacy continues in quieter forms, in places we might not suspect, in systems that still confuse control for care and fear for respect. Lesson 1. Discipline without compassion becomes abuse. Crowder Hill prided itself on discipline, on rules, on silence, on structure, but in stripping young men of their voices, their softness, and their emotional needs, it crossed a line. Discipline is meant to guide, not to grind a soul into silence. What began as an intention to build character turned into a system of punishment and emotional suppression. The result: generations of young men who graduated with sharp minds but shattered spirits, many of whom would carry invisible wounds into adulthood, never learning how to express themselves, trust others, or even feel fully human again. We must remember, discipline without love is cruelty wearing a suit. Lesson 2. Prestige doesn't equal purity. For decades, Crowder Hill was celebrated. Its alumni became judges, military officers, politicians. Its campus graced newspaper covers and society columns, but that external success became a mask, a shield behind which unspeakable things occurred. We live in a world that often worships institutions because of their age, wealth, or name. But the truth is, no place is too prestigious to be corrupt, no name is too noble to be questioned, no tradition is too old to escape examination. Power without accountability breeds silence, and silence allows evil to thrive. Lesson 3. Darkness thrives where children can't speak. One of the most chilling realities about Crowder Hill is how long it operated without exposure. For over 50 years, boys disappeared, suffered, and cried behind stone walls. And few outside ever knew. Why? Because the students weren't believed. Their letters were rewritten. Their cries were labeled as weakness. Their fears were dismissed as disobedience. Children are often the first to sense when something is wrong. And they are often the last to be believed. Crowder Hill teaches us that any system, school, home, church, or institution, that discourages children from speaking openly is one that puts them in danger. We must listen, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's inconvenient. Lesson 4. One voice can break centuries of silence. Though much of what happened at Crowder Hill was buried, hidden in sealed rooms, censored records, and coerced silence, it was ultimately one voice that broke the dam: James Hawley's. A teenage boy, alone and afraid, had the courage to write the truth. He didn't know who would read it. He didn't even know if he'd survive long enough for someone to find it. But he spoke anyway. And his words, buried under the floorboards for decades, would one day shatter the school's illusion of honor. James teaches us that the truth doesn't die in darkness, it waits. And when it's finally spoken, it becomes a weapon far more powerful than any punishment ever used to silence it. Lesson 5. Survival can be a seed of strength. Many who walked the halls of Crowder Hill emerged broken. But not all remained that way. Some men used their suffering to fuel compassion, to dedicate their lives to ensuring that no child would endure what they did. They became mentors, therapists, teachers, authors. They shared their scars so others could heal. Crowder Hill reminds us that pain, when processed, can become purpose. That survival, while not easy or noble in the moment, is often the first act in a larger story of healing and impact. Your past does not define you, but it can inform who you help. Lesson 6. We must never stop asking questions. The most dangerous thing about Crowder Hill was not the cold rooms, the hidden basements, or the rituals. It was the culture of obedience, a place where questioning was forbidden, curiosity was punished, and silence was rewarded. When institutions teach compliance over conscience, they breed generations of people who follow harmful orders simply because they are told to. The lesson: ask questions, challenge tradition, speak up when something feels wrong, because no legacy is worth protecting if it comes at the cost of a child's well-being. Crowder Hill is gone, but its lessons are not. The story stands as a haunting reminder that behind every curtain of respectability, we must look deeper. Behind every rule, we must ask, who does this protect? And behind every institution, we must demand transparency, not in memory of Crowder Hill, but in defense of every child still walking through the halls of systems that may look polished, but hold shadows beneath. Let us never forget. Let us never stop listening. And let us never stay silent again. Because this is not just about an old school, it's about systems that strip people of their humanity in the name of control. It's about finding your voice when others try to silence it. It's about how trauma, though deep, can be transformed into a legacy of strength, compassion, and purpose. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder to speak up for yourself, for others, and for truth even when the walls are thick and the silence is expected.